the prophecy of power. The world was not paying attention. That is the thing about catastrophic moments in history. They rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in quietly, dressed as routine, disguised as just another Tuesday. It was early 2024. The Russia-Ukraine war had been grinding for 2 years. Thousands dead, cities reduced to rubble, the global economy twisted out of shape by sanctions and supply chain chaos. The world had grown tired of the conflict, in the way that people grow tired of bad news, not because things had gotten better, but because the shock had worn off and exhaustion had set in. And it was precisely into this exhaustion that Russia decided to make its move. For months, whispers had been circulating through defense corridors in Washington, London, Brussels, and Beijing. Russia was preparing something big, not another ground offensive, not another wave of drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Something fundamentally different. Something that was meant to change the conversation entirely. Russia had been developing its next-generation hypersonic missile system for years. The official name was classified. Western intelligence agencies had assigned it a code designation. Military analysts had been tracking the program through satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and occasional deliberate leaks from Russian state media, leaks that were themselves a form of psychological warfare designed to keep adversaries nervous and off balance. The core claim was breathtaking in its ambition. Russia said it had developed a hypersonic glide vehicle capable of traveling at Mach 9, 9 times the speed of sound, while maneuvering unpredictably through the upper atmosphere to evade interception. It could, according to Russian military statements, strike any target in Europe within 4 minutes of launch. Any target on the continental United States within 18 minutes. And no existing air defense system anywhere in the world could stop it. If true, this changed everything. America had spent the better part of 3 decades and somewhere in the region of $2 trillion building and refining missile defense architecture, Patriot batteries, THAAD systems, Aegis destroyers, early warning satellites, an entire ecosystem of detection, tracking, and interception technology built on the foundational assumption that enough warning time plus enough interceptors equals protection. A Mach 9 maneuvering vehicle, if it worked as advertised, collapsed that assumption completely. There would not be enough warning time. The maneuvering would defeat tracking algorithms. The interceptors would not be able to predict the flight path accurately enough to achieve a kill. Russia was not just building a weapon. Russia was building an argument. The argument was this: the entire Western defense investment of the post-Cold War era is worthless. We have made it obsolete. We are untouchable. And you should factor that into every decision you make. The test was scheduled, the preparations were made, and the world, mostly unaware, went about its business. Chapter 1. The buildup. The facility chosen for the test was deep in Siberia, remote enough to limit civilian observation, large enough to accommodate the full range of the weapons system, secure enough, or so it was believed, to prevent unauthorized access or surveillance. Russian military engineers had been working at the site for 18 months. The launch infrastructure alone had taken 8 months to construct. Specialized fuel handling systems, advanced telemetry arrays, hardened command bunkers, a network of radar installations stretching hundreds of kilometers to track the weapon through its entire flight path. The investment was enormous. The expectations were higher. Senior figures from Russia's defense ministry flew in 3 days before the scheduled launch. Military observers from Belarus and several other allied states were quietly informed and given the option to send representatives. 2 officials from a major arms purchasing nation arrived under diplomatic cover, their presence unacknowledged in any official communication. The pressure on the engineering team was immense. This was not a routine test. This was a demonstration. The distinction matters enormously in weapons development because demonstrations have audiences, and audiences create pressure, and pressure causes people to make decisions they would not otherwise make, to compress timelines, to skip steps, to accept risk they would normally reject. Several engineers on the program had raised concerns in the months leading up to the test. Concerns about the thermal management system, the technology responsible for protecting the vehicle's guidance, electronics from the extreme heat generated by hypersonic flight through the atmosphere. At Mach 9, aerodynamic heating is ferocious. Temperatures on the vehicle's surface can exceed 2,000 degrees Celsius. Managing that heat, keeping the sensitive guidance and control systems cool enough to function, is one of the central engineering challenges of hypersonic weapons development. The concerns were logged. They were reviewed. They were ultimately judged acceptable. The test would proceed as scheduled. On the morning of the launch, the weather was clear and cold. Perfect conditions. The kind of day that feels like a good omen when you are standing in a frozen field in Siberia with the weight of your nation's military reputation resting on your shoulders. The countdown proceeded without incident. All systems reported nominal, the launch window opened, the order was given. Chapter 2, Launch Day. The missile left the launch platform at 11:47 a.m. Moscow time. For the first 47 seconds, it was perfect. The boost phase performed exactly as designed. The weapon accelerated through the lower atmosphere with controlled violence, shedding its launch shroud cleanly, transitioning to its glide phase with a precision that made the engineering team exhale with collective relief. Inside the command bunker, screens filled with telemetry data, speed, altitude, trajectory, thermal readings from sensors embedded throughout the vehicle's structure. Everything was in the green. The senior officer, present a general who had overseen more weapons tests than most people have had, hot meals, allowed himself a small, tight smile. Then, at the 53-second mark, something small changed. A single temperature sensor in the guidance bay reported a reading 40 degrees above its expected value. In isolation, this was a minor anomaly, the kind of thing that in a routine test might be flagged for later analysis without immediate concern. But the flight engineer monitoring that specific subsystem had seen this pattern before in simulation data, in laboratory tests of the thermal management components. She knew what it meant before the number had finished climbing. She reported it. Her supervisor looked, reached for the radio, stopped, looked again. The temperature was climbing faster now, 40 degrees above nominal, then 80, then 140. The thermal management system, designed to keep the guidance electronics within operational temperature ranges, was falling behind. The heat was winning. At Mach 8.7, the guidance system began to drift. The deviations were small at first, fractions of a degree in attitude, tiny errors in the navigation solution. The onboard computer detected them and fired correction commands. The control surfaces responded. But each correction generated more heat degraded the guidance system further. Further degradation produced larger errors. Larger errors demanded more aggressive corrections. The cycle accelerated in the way that only cascading technical failures can, faster and faster, each failure feeding the next, the whole system spiraling toward a threshold from which there was no recovery. At an altitude of 41 kilometers, the vehicle lost controlled flight. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. The aerodynamic forces acting on an uncontrolled body at hypersonic speed are not forgiving. The vehicle pitched violently, exceeded its structural load limits, and disintegrated in a detonation that vaporized most of the airframe and scattered the remaining pieces across a debris field 60 kilometers long. The fireball was visible from the ground 180 kilometers away, bright enough to be mistaken for a second sun by people who happened to be looking at the sky at that moment. Bright enough to be captured by a weather monitoring camera in a small town whose operator had no idea what he was filming. In the command bunker, nobody spoke for 11 seconds. Someone later counted 11 seconds of complete silence before the room erupted. Chapter 3, the internet finds out. The weather camera operator in the small Siberian town uploaded his footage to Telegram at 11:59 a.m., 12 minutes after the explosion. He did not know what he had filmed. His caption said something roughly equivalent to, strange explosion in the sky today. Anyone know what this was? By 12:10, the post had been shared 4,000 times. By 12:15, it had reached a Telegram channel run by a Ukrainian military observer group that had been tracking Russian military activity since the start of the war. They recognized the visual signature immediately, not as this specific weapon, but as a hypersonic test failure. They had seen footage of similar events before. They posted their analysis. The post reached Twitter within 3 minutes. From that point, the information moved at a speed that no government communications team was equipped to match. The open source intelligence community, that sprawling, informal, global network of analysts, researchers, satellite image enthusiasts, and military history, obsessives who spend their time on the internet doing work that would have required entire intelligence agencies 20 years ago, mobilized instantly. Within 40 minutes, an analyst in Finland had cross-referenced the video timestamp with the shadow angles visible in the footage and confirmed the approximate location to within 15 kilometers. A researcher in the United States had pulled commercial satellite imagery of the area from a past 2 hours before the event, identified the launch facility, and matched it against known Russian test sites in publicly available databases. A former aerospace engineer in Germany had analyzed the explosion's visual characteristics and estimated the approximate altitude and velocity at time of failure. All of this was published publicly, on Twitter, in real time, with sources cited, methodology explained, and images attached. By 2 p.m. Moscow time, less than 2 hours after the explosion, the global picture was essentially complete. The world knew what had happened, approximately where, approximately how, and approximately why. Not with the precision of a classified intelligence assessment, but with enough accuracy to make the basic facts undeniable. And then the rest of the internet arrived. The meme community, which operates on its own timeline, entirely disconnected from geopolitical gravity, had been working in parallel. The explosion footage had been looped, scored with various pieces of dramatic music, subtitled with increasingly creative commentary, and distributed across every major platform. A sound designer somewhere had isolated the audio from the original footage and added it to a video of a toy rocket failing. It got 8 million views. Someone created a fake loading screen that said, "Russia, hypersonic, v2.exe has stopped working." It was shared by people who had never followed military news in their lives. The hashtags multiplied. The jokes accumulated. The discourse split into 3 lanes simultaneously: the meme lane, the serious analysis lane, and the political argument lane, each moving at full speed, occasionally colliding, generating more content with every collision. Russian state television ran its evening broadcast without mentioning the event. This absence was itself immediately noted, screenshotted, and posted online as evidence. The silence became part of the story. Chapter 4. What this means for the world. The laughter was real. The embarrassment to Russia was real. But underneath both of those things, something more significant was happening that the meme cycle and the hot takes were not equipped to capture. Military credibility is not an abstract concept. It has concrete, measurable effects on the behavior of governments and the outcomes of conflicts. When a country's military reputation is damaged, genuinely damaged, not just in the opinion of adversaries who were already skeptical, but in the assessment of neutral observers and potential allies, it changes calculations across the board. Arms deals are reconsidered. Countries that had been in negotiations to purchase Russian military equipment quietly slow-walked those conversations. Defense ministers who had been making the case domestically that Russian weapons represented good value suddenly found the argument harder to make with a straight face. Alliance structures shifted in small but meaningful ways. Several nations that had been maintaining careful neutrality in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, unwilling to fully commit to either side, found their internal political calculations altered. The perception of Russia as a military superpower capable of deploying genuinely cutting-edge technology, had been part of what made neutrality feel like a reasonable position. When that perception took a hit, the calculus changed. Inside Ukraine, the effect on morale was significant. Ukrainian soldiers who had been living under the threat of Russian hypersonic strikes for 2 years, who had been told by their own military analysts that these weapons were essentially unstoppable, watched the same footage as everyone else. The psychological weight of facing an unstoppable weapon is considerable. The psychological relief of watching that weapon fail is equally considerable. Inside Russia, the effect was more complicated and harder to observe from outside. The state media blackout meant that the majority of Russians who relied on state television for their news remained unaware of the specific failure. But Russia has a large and technically sophisticated middle class with access to VPNs, Telegram, and international media. Among that population, the footage circulated. The reaction was mixed: genuine patriotic disappointment in some cases, private acknowledgement of systemic failures in others, and in some cases a kind of grim, dark humor that Russians have historically deployed as a coping mechanism for institutional dysfunction. The deeper strategic consequence was the one least reported in the immediate aftermath, but most significant in the long term. Weapons programs that fail publicly do not get canceled. They get accelerated. The political pressure generated by public failure demands visible recovery. Engineers get pushed harder, timelines get compressed, safety margins get reduced. The next test, whenever it comes, will be conducted under enormous pressure to succeed. And that pressure is itself a risk factor that increases the probability of another failure. It is a cycle that defense analysts recognize from the history of multiple weapons programs across multiple countries. Public failure creates political pressure creates rushed development. Rushed development creates technical failure. Technical failure creates public embarrassment. The circle continues. End game. The aftermath. 3 days after the explosion, the Russian government released a 3-paragraph statement through the official TASS news agency. It confirmed that a test had taken place. It described the test as part of an ongoing development program that was proceeding according to plan. It noted that the data collected would inform future development phases. It did not use the word failure. It did not acknowledge the explosion. It did not address the footage that had by this point been viewed hundreds of millions of times globally. The statement was treated with open derision by every Western government and media outlet that covered it, which is, of course, exactly what the Kremlin expected. The statement was not written for Western audiences. It was written for domestic consumption, to give Russian state media something official to point to give government officials a line to use if asked directly, to maintain the formal position that everything was proceeding as intended, even when nobody believed it. The gap between what the Russian government said and what the world knew to be true was not new. That gap has existed throughout the conflict in Ukraine, on questions ranging from battlefield casualties to the targeting of civilian infrastructure to the use of banned munitions. What was new was the speed and completeness with which the gap had been exposed. Not by intelligence agencies, not by investigative journalists with government sources, by a weather camera, a telegram post, and several hundred people on the internet who found the whole thing interesting. The open source intelligence community that documented the failure received more attention in the weeks that followed than it had in years. Articles were written about how amateur analysts with commercial satellite subscriptions and an internet connection had produced a more accurate and timely account of a classified military event than most government intelligence. Briefings. Defense departments in several countries quietly initiated reviews of how they accounted for open source intelligence in their threat assessment processes. The social media platforms that had hosted the content found themselves in a familiar but newly pointed debate about their role in military information environments. Russian government agencies filed removal requests for footage of the explosion across multiple platforms. The requests were largely unsuccessful. The footage was too widely distributed, the platforms too overwhelmed with the volume, the legal basis for removal too unclear. The content stayed up. The internet, as it generally does, retained its memory. Months later, satellite imagery showed resumed activity at the Siberian test facility. New construction, new equipment deliveries. The program was continuing. Of course it was. These programs always continue. The question was never whether Russia would try again. The question was, what kind of Russia would be trying a Russia that had learned from its failure and approached the next attempt with appropriate rigor and humility, or a Russia that had been embarrassed and was now moving faster than the engineering justified, driven by the political need to demonstrate that the failure was a temporary setback rather than a fundamental problem? The answer to that question would only become apparent over time. And the world, having watched the first act play out in real time on its phone screens, would be watching for the sequel. The missile had failed, the explosion had been seen, the internet had done what the internet does, amplified, analyzed, mocked, and moved on. But the underlying forces that had produced the moment were still in motion. The competition between great powers, the pressure on leaders to project strength, the gap between what weapons programs promise and what physics and engineering will actually permit, the inability of any government in the modern world to control the flow of information about its failures. These things did not end when the fireball faded and the hashtags stopped trending. They continued, quietly, in the decisions made in ministries and military facilities and engineering labs in Moscow and Washington and Beijing and a dozen other capitals. In the calculations of leaders who had watched the same footage as everyone else and drawn their own conclusions. The world had seen something that day. What it would do with what it saw was a different question entirely. And the answer, as with most important answers, was still being written.